And however far and, you know, distant my country may seem to you, I think that if you look at what is happening in Poland and how we deal with the past, it can help you to understand your own reality, because I think it's always comparisons make us understand better our own context. So I have chosen Jews and Jewish in Polish history because these relations were very complex. I mean, Jewish people had been our neighbors for centuries. So they were living next to us and in our towns, cities, villages. Sometimes relations were very friendly. Sometimes they were very hostile. But the Jewish are often represented as the symbol of the other. I mean, the non-Jewish and Jewish society were rarely very integrated in Poland, and the Jewish were perceived by the Polish society as the ones who are the other, different, for many reasons. Religion was one of the reasons. And what we have to know that just before the Second World War, Poland was the country that was very multinational. So 10% of people that was Jewish minorities, quite a lot. At the same time, we were the country with quite high level of anti-Semitism. Often this anti-Semitism was supported by the Catholic Church. And for example, one of the signs of this anti-Semitism was something like bench ghetto. So, for example, at Warsaw University before the war, there were special places, benches, only for the Jewish students, and others were for non-Jewish students, which was a very visible sign of what is going on. And then the Holocaust happened. The Holocaust, which was the plan and systemic plan for extermination of the Jewish population, and it was organized and prepared and realized by the Germans. But it happened it happened in Europe, but Poland was the main place where it was happening. And there were very different attitudes to the Jewish people during the Holocaust from non-Jewish society. And these attitudes, before I talk about them, we have to remember that in Poland during the war, there was death penalty for helping the Jews. So if you look at these attitudes towards Jews during the war, the attitudes presented by non-Jewish society, Polish non-Jewish, they ranged from selfless help to murder. So you see, it's a very wide range. Selfless help, which was just helping the Jewish who wanted to escape ghetto or who wanted to find rescue, shelter, food, whatever, through paid help, refusal to help, indifference, to murdering sometimes. And the problem is, when I speak about difficult history, that when I was at school and for many decades after the war, in Poland, we were taught that the only attitude we showed towards Jews was selfless help, actually. Which is true for many thousands of Polish people, although, I repeat, there was a death sentence for helping the Jewish people, but it was not the only attitude. I mean, we showed many others, but we didn't talk about that. And what happened after the Second World War, the problem of the other, of the Jewish population, of the Jewish society, still was somehow with us. I mean, the Jewish disappeared, almost all of them. Some of them during the Holocaust, some of them left Poland after the war, when it turned out that it's not always a friendly place. So they chose to leave Poland. And what happened to most or big part of the Polish society, non-Jewish society, was something called collective amnesia. So we kind of repressed that we had Jewish neighbors, that they were living next to us. And there were many reasons for this repression. One of them is that most of our society suffered during the war, of course, themselves, but they were always witnesses to suffering to the Jewish people. And it was being a witness or being a bystander who was in most cases indifferent. So that is not kind of memory that I think we like to keep. Another thing was that in many places, Jewish people left their houses, their workshops, their everyday objects. And after the war, people just started to live in these places, in these houses, and using the things that belonged to the Jewish families. And when you are in such a situation, you don't ask many questions. I mean, you don't ask very often the question, who was sleeping before me in this bed? Because the answer could be, it was the Jewish family who was forced to get on the train and ended life in gas chamber. So these kind of discussions usually did not happen. People forgot. People chose to forget and not to talk about that. Another thing is something that is wider context that was supporting this collective amnesia. You know, Poland is the country that has a long and painful history of oppression and a history of not having a their own state. So we developed this feeling of being victims. And in fact, we were victims, real victims in history many times. But this feeling of martyrdom or victimhood very often makes you more empathic, but sometimes makes you also insensitive to the fact that there were also other victims, like Jewish. Another thing is still strong influence of the Catholic Church that is very much supporting very traditional values, but also this narration of Poland as suffering for others and being victim. There is something that we witnessed, especially in last years, that is reborn nationalism. So that is the attitude presented also in the political mainstream, and which means the attitude that is very negative towards minorities, towards different groups that are very often described as not real Polish. Another thing is that we are very homogenic country. I mean, it's not the USA. 1970% of people identify themselves as Polish by ethnicity. So we have very little diversity. And in this situation, for many decades, we just repressed the fact that in our history, Jewish played a great role, and we kind of diminished sometimes their suffering. And at the same time, we saw ourselves, Polish people, as the main victims in the war. And in no way perpetrators or co-perpetrators. I mean, the Germans were pointed out as perpetrators. And, you know, some decades after the war, something happened in our public debate. We started to talk about something that happened in July 1941 in the small village of Jedwabne in the northeast of Poland. hundreds of Polish Jews, including women and children, were murdered. And they were murdered because they were forced. They were led to the wooden barn in the village by their Polish non-Jewish neighbors. And they were burned alive. They just burned alive. And of course, in this village, everybody knew about that. But it became obvious, or it became the topic for the public discussion some 50, 60 years after the war, around 2000 and 2002. So some publications came out, and we started the discussion. And we started as Polish people, as non-Jewish. We had to face the fact that we were not only victims of the war, but also perpetrators. I mean, you know, so far, I mean, until this time, the question, what did your grandfather do during the war, was reserved for the Germans. And suddenly this question became very relevant in many Polish families, because it turned out that we were not only innocent and clean. So we started this discussion, and it met with a lot of opposition and a lot of anger, because after being taught for decades that we are the nation of the innocents, for many people it was very difficult to realize that it's not the whole truth, that yes, in our society there are people who showed extreme bravery helping Jews during the war, but also there are people whose attitude was the opposite. And the situation today, the Polish landscape today, is the landscape in which we have the narration of the national pride, patriotism, superiority, regaining dignity. And at the same time, we have to face the fact that we are also perpetrators. So these two narrations are kind of contradictory. And in this situation, very often what is happening in Poland, we choose not to remember, or we choose not to face difficult history. It is explained by the social psychologists who say that every information on crimes committed by own group is just a threat to the image of your group, because it causes guilt and shame. The guilt and shame are the feelings that we don't like as humans, not only as the whole nations. So very often, and I see it in our everyday public discussions in Poland, very often we use strategies which regulate these negative emotions, guilt and shame. In other words, we escape from guilt and shame. How do we do it? There are some strategies that are described by scientists. First strategy to avoid shame and guilt is something called selection of situation. So, for example, if you talk to students, if you teach the Holocaust, if you teach history, but also if you talk just about the past, you concentrate on other aspects of history. So you speak about how great nation we were, how heroic past we had. Very often we overestimate the deeds of the righteous, of the people who were rescuing the Jewish people. So we say that they sometimes rescued more than they really did. This way we present a kind of history focusing on the heroic deeds. Another trick or way of avoiding shame and guilt is modification of situations. So you undermine the credibility of the source. The people say that they don't believe that it happened because this research cannot be, trusted. It can be trusted, in fact, but you just undermine the source of information. Or you try to censor or introduce special laws. Last year in Poland, we had a discussion because the government wanted to introduce the law that was punishing everybody who speaks about Polish as also perpetrators in the Holocaust. This did not happen, fortunately, but that shows the way of thinking. When you want to escape from shame and guilt, you just want to introduce the law that makes people mute and silent about some things. Another thing is that you can use to escape shame and guilt is directing attention. So, for example, you emphasize on a marginal character of a crime. So you say, okay, it happened, but it happened just in one place, not in other, which is not true. Or you emphasize on a marginal character of perpetrators. You say, they were not real Polish. So you exclude them from national community. Or you say, they were just criminals. So some outcast of the society. Not true again. Or you just do something that can be called competition of suffering and victimhood. You say, well, the Jewish people suffered, but we suffered too, or we suffered even more. Or you refer to conspiracy theories. So you say, well, the Jewish people always wanted to destroy our values, and they do it this time too, making up this story about pogroms and Polish guilt. And another way of avoiding or escaping shame and guilt can be, for example, accepting the facts. So you accept that, yes, Polish people took part in what was happening, but you diminish the meaning. So you emphasize some outer reasons of what we did and diminish inner ones. So in other words, you say, well, yes, Polish people also attacked the Jewish people, but it was because they wanted to steal something, to take over their property. That is the outer reason. And you diminish the inner reason, which very often was hatred, anti-Semitism. You can also dehumanize the victim. So you don't speak a lot about their feelings, how they felt before, during, and after, the ones who survived. And you speak a lot about your native people feelings. And finally, you can use something which is repressing the negative emotions, something that we hear in Poland quite often in the public discussions. Let's get rid of the shame. Let's not talk about that. Let's finish with this pedagogy of shame. We don't have anything to be ashamed of. That is quite simple solution, and it is effective only when it is helped by other strategies that I explained to you. And so that is what is happening. But what I want also to say that we do a lot in Poland, especially at schools, in educations, and very often libraries are involved in education about the past, also education about dark past, like, for example, and that is just one example, the Polish participation in what was happening during the Holocaust. This education over the feeling of shame and guilt. So we know that people don't like to feel ashamed, to feel guilty. And there are some educational ideas that let us teach about history, difficult history, but not referring to shame and guilt. Then, for example, is education based on empathy, like referring to individual stories, suggesting other forms of identity. So teaching not only about we Germans or we Polish, but we the Europeans, or we the people, we citizens of the city. We also pay attention to education about all attitudes, rescuers, perpetrators, bystanders, and showing universal mechanisms of evil. And I would like to show you some projects that comply with these points. And one of the projects, actually, that I am very much related to, started in the USA, in educational center, the Lowell Milken Center. That is the educational center in Fort Scott in Kansas. And they promote project-based learning, and they work with students and teachers, educators, to discover unsung heroes stories. Unsung heroes, so people who did something important, repairing the world, but are not recognized. And these centers started with the man that you see on your left, Norm Connard, who was a teacher, and Megan, the girl who also now works in the center, was one of his students. And one day, they discovered the story of Polish rescuer Irina Sendler, who during the war entered the Warsaw Ghetto and organized help smuggling the children from the ghetto and found places for them. And you know, in Poland, we didn't hear a lot about Irina Sendler before this project was realized. And the project started in 1999 in small Union town in Kansas. The history teacher and students found the magazine article Other Schindlers, that was about Irina Sendler, and they prepared performance about her. It became famous, and they came with this performance to Poland, and we also started to discover Irina Sendler. And the girls and the teacher visited Irina Sendler in Poland, in Warsaw, before she died. There were a lot of performances, but the most important thing is that these projects started, and these educational projects are run in different schools now around the world, and they were also in American students, did different projects on different unsung heroes. And they also teach how to teach about difficult history. For example, the Voluntary Prisoner Project about Ralph Lazo, a 17-year-old American student. When his Japanese American friends were interned during the war, Ralph Lazo chose to live in the camp with them in protest of the US government's racial discrimination. So that was one of the heroes found. Another was Ken Reinhardt, who supported his school friend who was African American. And there are many, many projects like this that are realized in the center. And all of them couldn't be realized without devoted librarians and the sources, because the students very often, they found the information about their heroes in the libraries, in the piles of magazines, in the books. They found a name that drew their attention, and they started to explore. In Poland, with my students, I realized the project, for example, about Maria Mikusz, the person who rescued a Jewish girl from ghetto, but also another project about a Roma woman. She belongs to Gypsy minority in Poland. And she is a teacher, and she does a lot to, bridge the gap between Roma and non-Roma society. And as I have told you, our society is very homogeneous and we don't have many minorities. Gypsies are the exception, but there are not many of them, but it is one of the most discriminated minorities. So this project was very good school for the participants, very good lesson for participants doing that, the lesson of tolerance and acceptance. During this realizing the project, we visited numerous libraries, museums. We were in a concentration camp, Auschwitz-Birkenau, doing interviews and using all the possible help to find materials, finally to do their website and documentary film about our unsung heroines. And we also, what we do to teach about the difficult past and to wake from this collective amnesia is bringing memory back. So we go to libraries and we ask about books, about our history, about local histories, and we ask about the history of minorities, also Jewish minority, and we find forgotten cemeteries, sometimes forgotten synagogues, and sometimes we realize some performances in the public space to remind people of the minority who lived next to us. We also, when we teach about the difficult past, we show these universal mechanisms of hate that is called pyramid of hate. So we show our students that very often something what is on the top, the genocide, that it starts from something that we tend to neglect, from bias, from stereotypes, from insensitive remarks, from jokes. Then, very often, we deal with the acts of prejudices, like bullying, name-calling, etc. Then the next step is discrimination, which very often leads to violence, which very often leads to genocide. And I'm not going to say that every anti-Semitic or homophobic or sexist joke leads to genocide, but I always stress that every genocide started from the language, from something that very often we don't pay attention to, that we just don't talk about, like using stereotypes, belittling jokes, non-inclusive language, that it's very dangerous stage, because if it is unattended, then we open the way to the worst things. And another way of teaching about difficult past is teaching about different sides that took part. For example, not only in the Holocaust, but in Holocaust, but in every type of oppression. So teaching about education about perpetrators. Also, if these perpetrators were the members of your own nation, of your own society, and it's important to teach in a complex way. So to teach about the complex character of human personalities, of moral choices, of context during the war, but also always to be based on credible sources. And there is no better place to find these sources than our school or city libraries. We also teach, on the example of concrete and personal stories and in the context of other attitudes. And it's very much the same when we teach about rescuers. So it must be with concrete and diverse biographies, always remembering about context. We always encourage students to reach in their local family history. And also we remind them, you know, we try to somehow stress to the need to avoid idealization. I mean, Irina Sendler was a great person who did incredible things, but sometimes she's described as if she was saint, holy. In this way, it's very difficult. She was, in a way, ordinary person. But if you describe her as a goddess, it's very difficult for students to identify with such a person. And finally, probably one of the most important aspects of teaching about different attitudes is education about bystanders. So making students aware that they can be witnesses, they can be bystanders. That is always teaching, remembering about what was happening during the war or in other situations, like, I don't know, in the USA, let's say, during the segregation. Without judgment, without judging anybody for what they, you know, didn't do, and also remembering about individual stories and diversity of witnesses. And when I teach about being bystanders, I love the method that I use with my students, and that is called the forum theater, or the theater of the oppressed. You know, that is quite a simple thing in which first, with a group of students, you talk about the situations of oppression or discrimination, bullying that they know or experienced. And then we choose one or two situations, and they play it, they act it, they show it. And in this performance, which is very short, it's just a couple of minutes, there must be a clear victim, perpetrator, and bystanders, 1, 2, or 3. And the thing is that we show this performance, this short story of bullying, oppression, and discrimination, and the audience watches it. And immediately after the first performance, we play it another time. But when we play it for the second time, everybody from the audience can say stop and can intervene. So they can, for example, enter the stage and play a bystander or anybody they want, and then we discuss if their intervention was effective, if it changed the situation. But also we have to, when we prepare this theater, we have to prepare our students to play it in a very good way. I mean, if somebody chooses to be a perpetrator, this person must build his story, his motives. The same with victim. So if somebody from the audience tells stop and tells us stop and says to the perpetrator, be nice, don't bully, the perpetrator on the stage cannot suddenly start to be nice, because it doesn't work like this in the real world. It would be just magical. It is called magical solution. Or somebody from the audience, somebody says to the victim, do something, shout at him, kick him. The audience, the victim usually says, but I couldn't do it. I'm not that strong. And I talk to the audience, and we explain that if the victim could shout, then he or she wouldn't be a victim. That's the point. I mean, the audience cannot change their characters in a way that suddenly a victim is a very strong person and perpetrator is just a peaceful sheep. No, it doesn't work like that. And then the audience understands that maybe the only influence they have is by using bystanders. So they start to suggest different solutions or types of behavior that bystanders can play. Very often, the members of the audience enter the stage and they play the bystanders who are not indifferent, but who are, you know, helping the victim or discussing with the perpetrator. And of course, then we talk about what happened. And we talk to the victim. Did it help you? Did it work? We talk with the perpetrator. And they usually say that, well, if the fact that somebody reacted made them weaker and made the victim stronger. So this theater of the oppressed is the method that lets our students practice to be active bystanders. And at the same time, that is the practice in a very safe environment, in the artificial environment. But there is hope that they will take this attitude with them. And maybe in the real life, they will be able to react if something happens. Okay, I've been talking for quite a long time. And I was, before our meeting, I was talking with Renee, and we said that maybe there should be time for you to ask questions. So if I could answer any of your questions, I would be happy to do that.
Marzanna, I have a question.
Yes.
And that is, before the American election, last American election, there was what I perceived was a wave of conservatism in the world. Part of that comes from the government change in Poland, also the government change in the Philippines, as well as Brexit. What do you see as the reason for this wave of conservatism and nationalism that's sweeping the world right now?
I think that the reasons are different in different countries. In Poland, it's relatively easy to explain. I mean, when the communism fell in 1989, we started to be a democratic country. So we started to build our democracy. And, you know, democracy is built on two pillars, that is equality and freedom. And we remembered about freedom, but we kind of forgot about equality. And many people felt very lost and forgotten in democracy because, for example, they lost their jobs. During the communism, everybody had a job. Everybody felt somehow, you know, if they didn't protest against the system, they could sleep safely and felt secure. So, and suddenly they lost jobs, they lost security, and they felt disappointed with democracy. And then in years, they saw that the gap between them and the ones who were the lucky ones in this new reality is bigger and bigger. Plus, of course, the things like, you know, Polish Jewish history, maybe it was kind of a backlash. I mean, finding out that we were not only innocent ones, also made people turn into traditional conservative values, also nationalistic values. But that is the Polish case. But I think it is if it was Polish phenomenon, you know, turning into conservative side, that would be easy to understand. But it's happening all over the world. So the only thing I can explain it by is that inequalities in the world are becoming bigger and bigger. The differences are bigger and bigger and wide. The gap is wider. And this feeling maybe makes people feel frustrated, depressed. And when you feel like that, very often you escape to very simple solutions. And very often I think conservatism gives...
And scapegoating.
Yeah. I mean, it gives... people find shelter in these traditional nationalistic values because that's something they know, that's something that things are simple to understand, to explain. You can find easily a scapegoat, the other, the strangers, the Jews, the refugees are to blame for our, lack of luck. So maybe that's kind of explanation.
Die Juden sind unser Unglück.
Sorry?
Die Juden sind unser Unglück. The Germans used to say the Jews are our misfortune.
Yeah. I don't know Germans, that's why I didn't understand. Okay, do you have any other questions?
Well, I have a quick question, and that is, what grade level were the students at the Theater of the Oppressed?
What was there?
What grade level? How old?
Yeah. So I do it at university, but I saw the plays that were realized with the primary school students and middle school students and higher school students. So, of course, you must be very careful. I mean, the younger students are the more careful, but many of them are aware enough. And of course, you should work a lot with them before. So, because, for example, I imagine that the role of a perpetrator, and you have to identify with this role, it needs a lot of maturity. So I personally would be very careful, and I would prefer students who are, I think, at least 15 years old to do that.
Well, I have a question. Okay, so thank you. This has been so fascinating and interesting, and actually have a million questions, but one of them is that this is just making me think about our difficult history, and it is currently Black History Month, and there's been some different, lots of different examples of picture books circulating that still have evidence of bias, and the one that came to mind is recently there's a quote in it that says, "Despite being a slave, Harriet was very happy," or something like that. So I connected with what you said about modifying a situation, and just kind of really, yeah. And so when we come across, and the same thing happened with Laura Ingalls Wilder recently, who's one of the authors that's been popular in libraries for, in schools for many, many years. So how can school librarians address books that contain bias related to our difficult past once they are, when they're being read in the classroom? Like how did that work in Poland with?
I think I don't think that in Poland, because what I'm talking about, it's quite a new thing. So we started to openly speak about these dark parts related to the Jewish relations relatively, not long time ago. And I'm not sure if there is a high awareness that our textbooks are biased. But when I work with, for example, with librarians, I try to teach them and show them that these books that are biased are a great source for us, for educators, teachers, librarians, to not to teach from them. Not, I mean, also, probably some parts of them are okay, but we can use them as a great source of, you know, practicing critical thinking. And that's what I do with, because I also, I was teaching English from textbooks, and I started noticing how biased they were and how much they used this avoiding shame of guilt, although they were just English textbooks. So they were supposed to teach you present perfect and passive voice. But for example, there was a text about colonialism. And in the text about colonialism, there was just the information that in year this and year, Christopher Columbus arrived in America, and then there were colonies, and that's it. Nothing about Native Americans. Then suddenly black people appear, and nothing or very little about slavery. So I thought, oh, they are terrible books. But then I didn't stop teaching from them, but I was, you know, paying students attention to their biased contents. And now I am trying to draw librarians' attention and teachers' attention to, you see, you have this book, use it to show how biased it is. And my experience shows that students and loves it. I mean, they love, because they think that the textbook or the books that we have in the library, it's something that has a stamp on it that it is authorized knowledge. And when you undermine the credibility of this, when you show the bias, they love it, because it's a kind of rebellion that you do and they can do. So, and for example, today, when I was speaking, or yesterday, when I was speaking to American students, they said, oh, it's the same. For example, they told me in our books, we learn a lot about Pearl Harbor, but not a lot about Hiroshima and Nagasaki and bombing. And the students were talking about slavery too, that it's not enough as it should be. But there is a lot about concentration on other aspects of history. So I think for the librarians, it can be a great exercise to look at some of their books and just to browse them and look how much contents is devoted to different topics, to minority groups, for example, to slavery, to segregation, things like that, to women. I mean, for example, the library that I go to in my city, one room in the library, there are books, but there are also pictures of famous scientists. All of them are men. No woman. I mean, that is the thing that we usually don't pay attention to. So, but maybe it's high time to look into the books, but also what is outside.
Love it. Thanks.
Thank you. Renee, you are the driver here. You are the leader, coordinator. I don't hear you.
Well, I have another question while she's figuring that out, if that's okay. I would love to hear more about the Unsung Heroes. Is that a website? Is that,
Yeah.
did you
Yeah.
share that? So that's a database that we can access as well?
No. What did you say? If I heard about?
Is the Unsung Hero, are you talking, is the Unsung Heroes a website, that a database that we all can access? Is it resource that we can use?
Yeah. So you should enter Lowell Milken Center. Let me show it.
Okay.
And that's this Lowell Milken Center for Unsung Heroes. And they organize great things, and they also, are you a teacher or librarian? I mean, you can take part in their activities, and they have great exhibition in Fort Scott. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Is it, so are those stories available through the database?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So we could pull up stories and share them with our populations and stuff.
If you enter their website, you find stories, and you can teach through these stories. Yes.
Yeah, I thought that was really neat. I like how you use technology to share these out. That's what I'm teaching, a technology class right now. We have a few students who are going to be thinking about how technology can be connected with social justice issues, and I think this is one great example.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so we still can't hear Renee, but
No?
I'm gonna try.
We don't hear the leader and the driver.
Yeah, and it says it's available, so it must be on her end.
Yeah.
So.
I don't.
Oh, there she is. There you are. It works.
It worked earlier. I don't know. I didn't do anything, I swear. Okay, that's weird. Can you hear me now? Yeah?
I can hear you.
Okay, I was just asking if anybody else had any questions. I saw that Rachel wrote in a question. She asked, should we be teaching students by remembering history and learning to live with prejudice?
Could you repeat?
She said, should we be teaching students by remembering history and learning to live with prejudice?
I'm not sure if I understand. I mean, I'm sure we should learn about history, and learning about history is learning also about prejudices. And also, I think when we learn about prejudices, we should use, for example, this pyramid and show where they can lead. And it's good if we show it on concrete examples. I'm not sure if I answered the question. But...
Oh, I'm sorry. She had two questions. I apologize. She said, do you think prejudice is innate in human nature, or is it a learned behavior? And then the second question was...
maybe the first one first, okay?
Yes. Well,
that is the eternal question. And, you know, I think the prejudice is not something we are born with. We are taught, and it's a long process. I know that we are born into the world of stereotypes and prejudices, and it's very difficult to be clean of it. But I think that we are, as humans, we are not born prejudiced. And I think that education really plays a fundamental role. But I also realize that education is just one environment in which we, school is one environment in which we are brought up. There is all the society, internet, families that very often are prejudiced, but we should at least try to do.
Absolutely. Does that answer the question? Sorry, Rachel, for seeing those out of order. I think that's it. I don't see any other questions.
I was going to ask a question.
Okay, yes, great.
How would you recommend starting the unsung heroes with younger children, like K through 3?
I know that these young children were doing great projects, and I'm sure I would start from entering Lowell Milken Center website and look at the unsung heroes they have.
Mm-hmm.
And also ask students or tell students about these heroes. That's one thing. But another thing, I think, because it's great if the hero or heroine comes from a student.
Mm-hmm.
So what is also advised is talk to students and ask them to talk with their families, with their neighbors about what they remember from the past. Do you remember anybody from the school who helped somebody who was bullied, who was somehow oppressed? Because these unsung heroes very often are not about somebody who died on the battlefield, which is bravery too, but it's about everyday bravery. Somebody shared his breakfast with his black friend during the segregation. That is kind of bravery. So, and maybe there are such stories in a local history, in families, but I think the great source of inspiration is the website, and maybe the students will like some heroes and heroines.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
All right, well, we're just gonna thank you for your time. I know that we have a student that wanted to talk to us, if Jen Yoder, if you can hear us, about SOLIS, or Olivia. But Dr. Pogorzelska, that was all we have for you.
Thank you very
we
much.
really appreciate you taking your time tonight.
Thank
and
you
we
so
have
much.
safe travels back home.
And I just want to show you, I think I have my email address. I would be more than happy if I could be in touch with you and answer your questions, send you materials, whatever.
Great.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. That was great for me.
Do we have Jen or
Yeah.
Olivia?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm talking because I'm the SOLIS president, and SOLIS is the
I'm sorry, can I leave now?
Yes, yes, thank you so much.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Yes.
Thank you.
So SOLIS is the organization that kind of put this on, and we're glad that you guys all attended. This was a great turnout. I hope you guys learned a lot from it. I only heard about half of it, so if anybody could share stuff with me, I'd be okay with that.
Well, we recorded it, so we'll be able to share that.
Okay, perfect. I'll watch it. So SOLIS, which stands for Student Organization of Library and Information Sciences, it's an organization within our library science department, which connects LIS students to enrich their experience during their course of study and after, whenever you guys graduate and become actual librarians. We are going to have a chapter meeting at the beginning of April, so keep an eye out in your email for a date on that and some more information about it. And we look forward to seeing everybody there. And does anybody have any questions?
Just to clarify, the chapter meetings are usually online too, just via Zoom like this, guys.
Yeah, the same format. We do a Zoom meeting. We'll send you a link. It's all just as easy as this.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right.
All right.
All right, everybody. Thanks so much for your time tonight. We're going to sign off.
Bye, everyone.
Hi, everybody. It's good to see you all here. Hope you all liked that. I thought it was awesome.
It was awesome. It was great. Glad to see how many people attended. That was great.
Yeah.